If I tell you that I'm evaluating a company's performance now, and the way I look at the company is first by looking at its income, and then its expenses. And then I know I should have subtracted the expenses from the income, but instead I add them together and tell you how great this company is. Am I ridiculous? And yet, this is exactly the method we have been using to evaluate a country's performance. And the method we use is called GDP. I would like to talk about what's wrong with using GDP as a measurement for a country's economic prosperity. And I will also talk about what is a better way, a method, in place of GDP to measure a country's true progress. First, let's look at what's wrong with using GDP. GDP, the gross domestic production, is merely a gross tally of products and services bought and sold. However, it treats every transaction the same. Some transactions add to the well-being of a society. Others not only not add any value, but diminish the value. It does not separate costs from benefits. It does not distinguish the productive activities from destructive activities. In another word, GDP regards every monetary transaction the same and adds them up to assume that they all contribute to the well-being of the society. This is no different from what I just said at the beginning, how I would lump together all the business activities and lump together the income and expenses. How crazy this would be. What's crazier is that GDP does not look at anything that is not monetary. In another word, if the citizens and companies do a lot of volunteer work with no money exchanged, then GDP does not count that. If you contribute a lot of effort in protecting the rivers and mountains, when there is no money exchanged, your effort does not count in GDP either. Therefore, if our social structure and natural habitat break down, GDP does not care. Worse yet, when they break down, the money spent to restore them contributes to GDP growth. This is why GDP is fundamentally misleading. Now, let's look at the flaw of GDP in detail a little bit. There are majorly 6 big areas that GDP is misleading. First one, GDP does not reflect that crime and natural disasters are a liability to the society, but treat them as economic gains. This is because when we have crimes, we would need more locks, let's say, or security doors, or a police force, property damage, repair, and even medical costs. And all of these monetary transactions are added up into contributors of GDP. Several years ago, Hurricane Andrew was a disaster for southern Florida. But guess what? GDP recorded it as a booster to the economy of well over 15 billion. And GDP does not count the huge loss and damages from Hurricane Andrew. That's the first flaw. Second flaw, GDP does not take into account the non-market economy of household and community. And let me give you an example what I mean by that. There are lots of childcare and elderly care carried out by family members without any pay. These goes unnoticed by GDP, as it will only count those childcare expenses or elderly care expenses in a facility. In another word, pursuing high GDP encourages people to go away from taking care of their elderly or young at home, and instead to put the elderly and young into the facilities. And same thing goes with volunteer works, which are not counted by GDP. So pursuing GDP incentivizes people not to do volunteer work, but only do the paid work. Why should we care about volunteer work, you might ask? In fact, much of the volunteer work is crucial in keeping the crime rate low, in counseling those having problems with the drugs and alcohol, or those suffering from psychological problems, or helping people after a natural disaster. When we don't value volunteer work, these problems exacerbate in our society. So that's the second one. The third flaw, GDP wrongfully treats the depletion of natural resources as income. It should in fact be treated as the depreciation of an asset. This is a clear accounting rule. Where are the accounting professionals in our country? The consequences of pursuing a high GDP number is therefore for the country to deplete as much natural resources as possible for the current government and current generation, without regard to the future generations. That's the third one. The fourth flaw, those polluting activities increases GDP. That might be to your surprise. And at the same time, when later cleaning up the pollution, the GDP goes up too. We all know that several years ago, American oil company Exxon had a huge oil spill in Valdez, Alaska. Exxon's oil production, while polluting the environment, adds to the GDP. Now, cleaning up the oil spill, because it costs billions of dollars, also contributes to GDP growth. So that's ridiculous. The fifth flaw, GDP takes no account of income distribution. For example, in the US from 1973 to 1993, during these 20 years, GDP rose by over 50%. But the wages not only did not grow, but declined almost 14% during the same period. And the top 5% of the households, by contrast, increased their income. If we only look at the GDP, we would think that things were going so great for the ordinary people during this period in the US. But that's not the truth. Lastly, GDP ignored the drawbacks of relying on foreign assets. We Americans especially borrow a lot from abroad for our consumption within the country. This borrowing temporarily raises the GDP, but the paying back the debt gradually becomes a burden. GDP calculation totally ignored the downside of the borrowing. It is for these 6 major flaws that relying on GDP to reflect on how a country is doing is very problematic. When any country pursues GDP growth just for the sake of the GDP numbers, it gives the whole society wrong incentives of making as many monetary transactions as possible without caring for the cost of these transactions. However, we do have hope. There is a better way to measure a country's true progress, and that's what we will discuss in our next episode. Thank you for watching.